It's great to see a full room on a critically important issue that we were just discussing is not getting enough attention in the current context. Good afternoon, I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you all to this special event, the ongoing mass atrocity crimes against the Uyghurs, and critically, how can the UN respond? I would like to thank our partners for this event, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. This event aims to raise awareness and galvanize discussion about the role of the United Nations in responding to and preventing mass atrocities in the Xinjiang region. Now nearly 3 years after the release of the report by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights detailing violations against the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities that the High Commissioner noted may constitute crimes against humanity. Just last year in August, OHCHR released an update on their work in China, sharing that they continue to engage with Chinese authorities, including on Xinjiang. It's a brief note. The updated report did state in June that a UN human rights team visited China and engaged in dialogue with the authorities, specifically on counterterrorism policies and the criminal justice system. In particular, on Xinjiang, OHCHR noted that it, quote, understands that many problematic laws and policies remain in place. The statement continued that OHCHR has, quote, called again on the authorities to undertake a full review from the human rights perspective of the legal framework governing national security and counterterrorism, and to strengthen the protection of minorities against discrimination. Allegations of human rights violations, including torture, need to be fully investigated. China has, of course, taken issue with these statements and disputed any accusations. And so the question remains, how can the UN best respond? We will begin our event today with a film screening of the Emmy Award-winning documentary short, Re-Educated, which was produced by The New Yorker. I had a chance to pre-screen it, and it is quite stunning. We have the filmmaker here. The film tells the story of 3 strangers who grew up in Xinjiang, immigrated to Kazakhstan, and then were imprisoned together in a camp after returning to China. And I'll just say it's really fascinating to watch in some respects, because this is, it's kind of an invisible crime. We don't know much about these camps, and based upon these 3 former inmates' descriptions, there's animation, and you can feel present in their context. After the film, we will have a discussion with the filmmaker and an excellent group of panelists who I will leave to be introduced by our partner, Naomi Kikoler, Director of the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, who will be our chair, our moderator. And allow me just to say, Naomi, it's really great to see you. It's great to have you back, and really am sincerely grateful to you for bringing this film to our attention and giving us the opportunity to highlight this incredibly important issue.
I'd like to just start by thanking our colleagues at IPI, Adam and the entire team, for hosting the event today and for using the power of your place across the street from the United Nations headquarters to have this important conversation and to show the incredibly powerful film that we just watched right now. I'd like to just recognize the film's director, Sam Olsen, writer Ben Mock, 2 other partners in the film making, Matt Hun and Nick Rubin, who couldn't be here, for the remarkable work that they did, helping to shed light on the horrific atrocities that have been perpetrated against the Uyghur and other Turkic communities. and also to help humanize an experience that, as Adam said at the beginning, it's often hard to kind of penetrate, especially when the Chinese government has gone to such lengths to hide and obscure the nature of the crimes, which, as we'll talk about today, are ongoing. It is a deep and profound honor to be joined with such remarkable people that we have here today for this conversation. And I first want to just recognize Ben Monk, the writer and filmmaker of the film Reeducated. I'd like to acknowledge Rishan Abbas, who is the founder and executive director of the Campaign for Uyghurs. And Rishan's sister, Gulshan, has been missing and detained since now 2019. I'd like to also recognize another force of nature, Rehan Asat, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, whose brother, Ekpar, has been detained since 2016. And then the tireless Sophie Richardson, the co-director of the Chinese Human Rights Defenders. It's a real deep and profound honor to be here with each of you as we talk about the plight of the Uyghur community today. We're going to do kind of 2 rounds of questions and then open it up for all of you to be able to ask the panelists questions. So I just wanted to start, Ben, the movie that you made is incredibly moving and powerful, as everyone just witnessed. And making a film like this is incredibly difficult. Trying to tell the story of a community that few people can reach presents unbelievable challenges. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you overcame some of those challenges to shed light on what the government of China is trying to conceal.
Sure. Thanks for having me at this event, and thank you for screening the film. We're really pleased that it's had a long life and continues to be shown and a useful piece of journalism. So I started reporting from Kazakhstan in 2018, which was at the height of the expansion of these extrajudicial detention camps in China. And I began by collecting eyewitness testimonies and also testimonies from family members who had had relatives and loved ones disappear into this extrajudicial network. And at the time, it was relatively rare for people to be released from these centers and then to get out of China where they could potentially speak about their experiences. This film is part of a larger New Yorker investigation. In total, I spoke to around a dozen people who had themselves been detained in these detention centers and many dozens of people who had had family members go through this experience. In some cases, they were still in contact with relatives in Xinjiang. And at some point in 2019, I became aware of the fact that there were 3 men, Kazakh men, who had been detained in the same detention center and who had all managed to get back to Kazakhstan. They'd all been released. This was through the Xinjiang Victims Database. And so together with Sam Wilson, my collaborator, and Matt Wynn, the artist, who's also here, we proposed this project to the New Yorker and went to Kazakhstan to interview them and many other former detainees. And the kind of special advantage that we had with this reporting situation is that we had 3 men who had been in the same facility, and these facilities are locked down, and there's no ability to report independently from within Xinjiang. So we had kind of a preponderance of eyewitness testimony about this one facility. In addition to a variety of other kinds of evidence, including satellite photos and state procurements, hiring notices for security guards and police officers and that kind of thing. So we had a good sense of what the campaign looked like. And from these eyewitness testimonies, we were able to get a really robust sense of what happens inside these camps. And also we're able to recreate the physical space of this particular camp in Tachang, and we were able to corroborate details among the 3 men who had, who had not known each other at the time, but who had been detained together and who came to know each other in detention. So this was a rare amount of source material. And the film that we originally put together is actually a virtual reality film. So you put on like a VR headset and you're kind of in the space. And we worked with the men, with a variety of other kinds of information to recreate that space with as much attention to fidelity as we could, what the classroom looked like, where the security cameras were, what the space outside the camp, which used to be a retirement home, looked like. And so the film you just saw and the accompanying New Yorker investigation tries to give a sense of what these camps felt like for people who were detained there, the kinds of things that they learned, the kind of conditions in which they lived, while at the same time giving a broader overview of the kind of rise of a police and surveillance state in Xinjiang, using a variety of other kinds of sources. But having these three men who were detained together in the same camp in Tacheng was really rare and allowed us to, with ambitions of kind of as close and as forensically as possible, recreating these spaces that were completely inaccessible to journalists and remain inaccessible to journalists.
It's truly remarkable what we were able to do, and I do want to recognize Matt. I'm sorry I didn't realize that you were here, who was the artist who did the remarkable renderings that you saw in the film in such a sensitive and respectful way. The work is so incredibly rigorous in terms of the efforts that went behind documenting the stories, but also the care that was given, the fact that you're listening to the music, hearing the language. These are things that the Chinese government has also tried to essentially erase as well. And that leads me to a question for you, Rashan. Adam, when he opened, mentioned the report from 2021 that the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights released, where they stated that the crimes may constitute crimes against humanity. And in it, they talked about detention, but also other things, including forced sterilization, forced marriage, a host of horrific kind of human rights violations. And I was wondering, there has been, as the film noted in its closing, an effort to suggest that many of these practices in detention have also ended. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the situation in Xinjiang has changed since that report came out in 2021.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming here to listen to us. It was extremely difficult for me to sit and watch this film. I watched a couple times, previously screened in Washington and the other parts, but still, every time when I watch, it affects me the same way. It's extremely difficult to sit through. Because my sister was in a re-education camp like this for 6 months before she was sentenced for 20 years in the false charges. To answer your question, Naomi, since the report was being released, did the situation change? No. It got rebranded, and the Chinese government just evolved the tactics to deceive the international community because they're getting away with it. They're getting away with the mass internment. They're getting away with the forced sterilizations, forced abortions. They're getting away with forced labor. These people that you saw in camps like this, at one point was 3 to 5 million, according to the Chinese government's own white papers. These are people like you, the mothers, fathers, brothers, professors, university presidents, and successful business owners, famous pop star. All these people were taken not because they committed any crimes, because they were born Uyghur and that they lived under the CCP's dictatorship regime. So I participated in a panel like this in September 2018 in Washington, D.C. at Hudson Institute, speaking about the camps and the policies and the outlining the fate of my in-laws. My husband's entire family went missing, 24 people. My parents' in-laws, all of his sisters and brothers and their spouses, and the 14 of his nieces and nephews. I talked about that. 6 days later, they arrested my sister, a retired medical doctor. And she was in the re-education center for 6 months. Then when I doubled down my efforts, while the Chinese government is discrediting me and calling me Rushan Abbas is stealing other people's photo, claiming this is her missing relatives and spreading lies about China, they charged her on the terrorism-related charges. And now she's serving 20 years in jail. She will be 63 in June. And it has been almost 7 years that nobody heard anything from her. The UN report stated everything that constitutes the crimes as genocide and crimes against humanity, but we couldn't even get a resolution passed. We couldn't get the attention of the international communities. We couldn't get the support of our Muslim majority countries or Central Asian republics. And now, just the last year, 2024, Dr. Adrian Zentz's recent report stated that 3.34 million Uyghurs being transferred as a part of labor transfer, as forced laborers. So the Chinese government is not only genociding the Uyghur people in bright daylight on everyone's watch, the world is making benefit out of this genocide by Uyghur slaves' sweat, tears, and the blood, and making all of us complicit, actually. When those companies use Uyghurs as forced laborers for their supply chains, when we use those products, we are not just being complicit with this genocide, we are being enablers and sharing the Chinese Communist government's crimes. Just last week, apparently, the Chinese mission sent out a letter to all the missions and saying that this is a lie and you should not be participating. If they have nothing to hide, why are they so afraid of our voices? I'm not the politician. Rehana Set is not the politician. We are families of those victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Rushan. All too often, the burden of trying to get the world to act falls on the shoulders of survivors and their families. And Rehan, you are a legal advisor, policy advisor, and you are so deeply committed to working on this issue as well because of the fate of your own family. What is it that you think the UN system can and should be doing to protect the Uyghur community? What types of actions do you feel need to be prioritized?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. You know, in addition to being a human rights lawyer, I'm also a scholar who's currently doing research on the rise of authoritarianism and its impact on international rules-based order. And in order to, before even begin to talk about what can the UN do to end the atrocity crimes, it's important to understand the broader structures that we came to know as these multilateral institutions that originally envision so that member states that can come together and based on general principles of peace and diplomacy to conduct business. But today, the liberal multilateralism has shifted, according to many scholars, very fair assessment, a new form of multilateralism, and that is authoritarian multilateralism. And it's been pushed by new kinds of norm entrepreneurs, especially China and Russia. The reason this kind of norm entrepreneurship was very successful is because of the norm followers and as well as complicity of Western democracies on a whole host of issues. China's authoritarian agenda as a norm entrepreneur is not only repeated at the UN forums, but also being internalized by a number of states. And when these practices do happen, ultimately, its impact is on human rights issues. And first and foremost, we saw a resolution to have a debate on the High Commissioner's report. Completely, we couldn't even have that resolution passed. There was an impasse. And if we don't talk about this kind of authoritarian norm entrepreneurship, because oftentimes the Uyghur issue has been seen as this like a silo issue. It's happening in the far reaches of China that doesn't affect the entire international system. It actually does. It does because what the Chinese government is pushing is a new kind of terrorism laws that has a far-reaching consequences. They added the right to self-determination as a counterterrorism. They added a fundamental and constitutionally recognized religious and cultural practices, also a form of terrorism. So what ends up happening is that when individuals flee persecution, come to Thailand or countries like Kazakhstan, they would be charged with terrorism. And the reason why the Chinese government is so successful is that in addition to being at this norm entrepreneur at the UN institutions, they're also imposing and establishing a parallel order through regional bodies that the Chinese government, because of its mighty power, able to establish what we know as Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In order to sign on to and be a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you need to recognize China's definition of international law, which is sovereignty about anything and non-interference of its internal affairs, including human rights violations. And when countries are faced with two treaty obligations, then your treaty obligation under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization must trump your obligation under any other international law. And that's the environment under which all of us are doing advocacy to push and making sure the Uyghur issue remains on the top of the UN agenda. And that's why it's been very difficult. But I really want everybody to understand that what China is doing as this new norm entrepreneur does have a global ramifications for the international law. And that's why we're witnessing what Professor Tom Ginsberg called the rise of authoritarian international law. Today, the High Commissioner just tweeted like a few hours ago that I urge we must put human rights where they belong at the top of the global agenda. But however, since the report has been issued, he issued this very quick China update, but then a few weeks later when he issued a global update on human rights violations occurring all across the world, then he didn't mention China. Now, countries wouldn't, or your average citizen wouldn't look at country-specific report, but look at the global report to have a better sense of what's happening. And then when we dance around, well, I just issued a report, maybe, but I cannot upset the Chinese government, so I need to be very careful. There are a lot of issues where a specific UN body is dedicated to that particular issue, no matter how difficult it has been. But when it comes to Uyghur atrocities, we don't even have a special rapporteur that's specifically working on this issue, like any other issues. You name it, Sudan, Afghanistan, Myanmar. But when it comes to Uyghurs, no. And that is the reality. Now, I've done advocacy both in New York and Geneva. Every time when I have conversations, since this event is taking place in New York, I do want to mention that having a discussion on human rights issues in New York is particularly difficult because here everybody wants to talk about politics and it's like political issues, UN Security Council being here, and they tend to delegate all these issues to the human rights town, Geneva. Then we go to Geneva, we have a conversation. Then the missions over there are very sympathetic on the Uyghur issues, but then they still have to seek the approval and support from the capitals to issue any sort of decision on the Uyghur issue. So what ends up happening is that you end up just doing like constantly forum shopping without achieving much. I do believe that there is a mechanism under which uniting for peace, that the UN General Assembly came together for Ukraine. Such a mechanism can be explored for the Uyghur issue too. You may say that, well, it's not a charter violation, so we have to be careful, that's not designed for the system. But if you can borrow from the responsibility to protect or other doctrines, you could come up as a very effective strategy to end the atrocities against the Uyghurs as well. And last, I would say that I urge UN member states to explore a third complaint against China. Take up the Uyghur cause. This is at the roots of it is a racism, it's a violation of third convention, and we must file a complaint. International law can only be flourished when we use it, when we utilize it. Otherwise, we're robbing the international system from further development, and we must use the system for the Uyghur cause as we have done for other atrocity crimes.
Thank you so much for that, Rehan. So just to summarize, one is reporting the need for bureaucratic bravery, including specifically by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The second is getting this on the agenda. You suggested Uniting for Peace and having the GA take this on. The importance of special procedures and the Human Rights Council also having some bravery there. And then also the avenue of CERD. You know, Sophie, hearing that, you know, we've worked a lot with you. We focus on what we consider to be neglected cases. This is a situation that it's been almost impenetrable hard to break the international community's kind of recalcitrance or kind of reluctance to deal with it. How would you characterize the response, and do you see any openings, any possibilities for change?
Sure. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me to be here to the Holocaust Museum and to IPI, and it's always a real privilege to be here, especially with my good Uyghur friends. And Ben, Sam, congratulations on the film, which is amazing. Naomi, there's a lot to talk about. I think it is very telling that once again the Chinese government and the mission here in New York felt compelled to send a note verbal telling members of missions here not to show up. I think that's its form of reprisals directed at other governments. And we have once again just observed the Chinese government rank among the top governments in the Assistant Secretary General's annual reprisals report, which tracks government's efforts to persecute people for trying to interact with UN human rights mechanisms. Naomi, your question is a big one. Xi Jinping figured out early on that he was not going to have to pay a particularly high price for committing gross human rights violations at home, which in my view then prompted him to start exporting them and carrying them out with increasing frequency in other countries. And that's why we're not only spending a lot of time tracking issues like transnational repression, but also increasingly governments are having to deal with the various ways that the Chinese government is abusing human rights inside those democracies. The influence, I think, that the Chinese government wields across the UN system, I would commend everybody to the work that was published this week by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, tracking particularly harassment of activists at the UN, I think is quite telling. The Chinese government sinks a lot of resources into trying to prevent real action across the UN system, and to a certain extent, it's been extremely successful. It has been 8 years since I first received a call from somebody in a Uyghur diaspora community in Europe saying that all of a sudden they couldn't reach family members at home. And 8 years later, what have we accomplished? It leaves a lot to be desired. Now, we could choose to abandon the system, we could choose to try to fix it, but I think that our Uyghur brothers and sisters also deserve the urgency of actions that take place outside the UN system. So here's my brief to-do list that sort of speaks to both. First of all, I think the High Commissioner for Human Rights strategy of occasional public rhetoric and I think largely fruitless dialogues with the Chinese government clearly hasn't worked. There's been no change in law, policy, there have been no mass releases, and there's been no accountability. I think he needs to commit immediately at least comparable resources to what he's spending on these dialogues to updating the findings of the 2022 report and brief the Council on those findings before the end of this year. The clock is ticking, and every day that goes by and projects like this don't advance is just deepening the agony of the Uyghur community and emboldening Xi Jinping. If the current Human Rights Council can't or won't have another go at the kind of resolution that would bring a debate, that's all that resolution sought to do, is to have a discussion about what's happening in the Uyghur region. If that can't happen in the near future, I think by the end of the year, the states that have repeatedly shown concern about this issue should come together in a consortium as they have done on other comparable crises to, among other things, compare notes and establish some sort of investigative mechanism that would start gathering evidence from victims and survivors. That is not a particularly challenging thing to do. it's certainly CHRD's view that governments that consistently rank at the top in the reprisals report should be prohibited from serving on the Human Rights Council for at least one term, if not longer. I certainly hope that particularly the diplomats who are with us this afternoon will take that idea back as we start thinking about elections for the next Human Rights Council members later in the fall. I agree entirely that this degree of resistance should merit that much more support across the system through the establishment of at least a special rapporteur on China, ideally one specifically on the Uyghur region. Both would be great. The special procedures suggested years ago that there be a special session at the Council on China. I think that is just as valid now as it was then. And last but not least, this doesn't get talked about very much, and it should. There are roughly 24 UN agencies that have a presence in China. They play almost no functional role in tracking, monitoring, reporting on, or assisting with human rights violations. I think if those agencies cannot perform in the course of their duties that basic function, which is meant to be one of the core purposes of the UN system, we need to question really what utility they're playing and whether they're helping whitewash abuses. Last but not least, I think governments really need to think carefully about the extent to which they wish to engage in very glossy events the Chinese government is hosting as it claims a global human rights leadership mantle. And I'm thinking particularly of the gathering that will take place in September to mark the 30th anniversary of the landmark Women's Conference. I would love to see some courageous UN actors and diplomats, if you're going to attend that event, ask about all of the Uyghur women who've been wrongfully detained. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Just such a clear articulation and also a good reminder about the 24 UN entities that are present in the country as well, and let's think creatively about that. I wanted to take it back, Ben, to you. The film has been out now for a few years. You remain very vested in continuing to tell this story and also researching kind of transnational repression. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what are the continuing kind of relevancies that you see of the film today.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I do think the film continues to be relevant. And I also want to point out that last year, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum published a report by the scholar Ryan Thum, which was, I think, very careful and very comprehensive in describing some of the ongoing measures that have been happening in China since the pandemic, when a lot of the kind of conventional sources of reports became less accessible to journalists like me. So, the Chinese government claimed that all of the, as you saw in the film, all of the students being re-educated in these what were called vocational training centers graduated, and it does appear that the camps were going through a process of being dismantled in 2019 and 2020. But that doesn't mean that these people were simply freed. At the same time, we know that the Chinese government was rapidly expanding the construction of prisons, and that many graduates of these centers went on to receive long prison sentences. Even Yerbaket, one of the protagonists of the film, received a 7-year prison sentence for having WhatsApp on his phone before he was released, largely, we think, because of advocacy in Kazakhstan, because he was Kazakh and married to a citizen of Kazakhstan, was not Uyghur, who have far fewer advocates outside of China. So there's been a massive expansion of the prison system. We know that through construction bids and satellite photos that suggests that there are prisons large enough to hold well over 1 million people in Xinjiang, on top of which there's pretrial detention centers, which have commonly been used to hold Uyghurs and other Turkic and Muslim people arbitrarily or based on vague accusations. There's also house arrest. Many people who are released, including some of the people we interviewed for the New Yorker investigation, after they left the camp were placed under house arrest and forced to attend meetings and schooling and give forced confessions. There's also the issue of boarding schools, which have expanded and which the Chinese government has in fact defended by comparing them to the boarding schools in which indigenous people were put into in the US and Canada, and has used the existence of those schools as a reason that the US has no standing to criticize China's policy in Xinjiang. And then there's issues that other panelists here have talked about: forced sterilization, and then transnational repression, which is where my recent reporting has focused. There are thousands of Uyghurs living in other countries who have fled China. There may, in fact, be tens of thousands in Turkey alone, and hundreds in other countries where they have precarious residency statuses or no residency status at all. I wrote a story I co-wrote a story for the New York Times Magazine with the Uyghur researcher Nirula Elima about a Uyghurs' flight through Thailand and about Thailand's history of deporting Uyghurs to China in spite of valid asylum claims. China has issued Interpol red notices in order to facilitate the deportation or the extradition of Uyghurs who are claiming asylum in other countries, be it Thailand or Malaysia or Turkey. Some of these red notices have been rescinded because they were determined by Interpol to be abusive. In general, China gives little or no evidence of any actual wrongdoing that would justify the deportation of these Uyghur asylum seekers. And they have many other means of transnational repression, of putting pressure on Uyghur activists abroad, as I know the people sitting next to me know. So I would say all of those are contemporary and continue to be relevant issues, and deserve attention from the UN and from other relevant agencies. And the status for asylum for Uyghurs continues to be very poor. Canada has agreed to resettle 10,000 Uyghur asylum seekers, mostly from Turkey. That was years ago. So far, none have been resettled. The US has also agreed to prioritize the resettlement of Uyghur asylum seekers, and that also has not happened. UHRP has found that more than 1,000 applications for Uyghur asylum seekers are still being processed after years and years of waiting. I'll stop there.
Ben, thanks so much, and also just for calling attention to the fact that certain governments have put out commitments, but we've yet to see there being actual kind of concrete action. The promise of asylum is the promise of a future where you can be safe, but to have not seen that take place is a real challenge. I did just want to note that in Ryan's paper that you mentioned, one of the things that he talks about is that there have been certain changes in terms of the kind of overt surveillance and police presence, and that sometimes external visitors take that then as a sign that the repression and persecution has kind of ended. But in fact, as the paper shows, the tactics have changed. And with that, Rishan, I wanted to ask you, I mean, Ben talked a lot about transnational repression. You and Rehan have both experienced that firsthand, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, from the perspective of the Uyghur community, what is it that you are asking of governments to do to try to help protect you and other advocates?
Thank you. Also, the Uyghurs in diaspora, we live in free countries, but in reality, we are not free. We always face intimidation, threats, even death threats, harassments, constantly attacking us and demonizing us in the social media. Now with AI and the deepfake, they are making the videos and the voices and sending out to divide the community, and myself actually being targeted for all kinds of threats. Last October, when we had the World Uyghur Congress election in Sarajevo, Bosnia, just 2 days before we left, me, my husband, and a couple other the Uyghur community members, 4 of us were being threatened. There was like video clip on YouTube calling for our execution. And then when we arrived in Sarajevo, the first day we are sitting in the conference room like this, I received an email showing the picture of the room and saying that it's a nice room that you are in. And then there's like 15, 20 pieces of machine guns and asking me, which one do you want to choose? basically asking me which one I want to be killed with. But we feel like we have absolutely no protection from the governments. My husband is currently in Indonesia. He just arrived last Saturday. I was at one of the community events sitting and getting ready to speak with one of my fellow Uyghurs. He was there too, among the audience here right now. Then I got a message from my husband. He's a US citizen to going to Indonesia. He doesn't need visa, but he got actually valid speaker visa before he traveled and arrived there to speak in some of the conferences. But when he was entering the country, he was detained and they put him in the detention room, denying his entrance to Indonesia because of the Chinese government's threats. And we immediately got the US Embassy and the State Department here and the NSC, a lot of people involved, was constantly working for like 2-3 hours that evening. He was able to enter Indonesia, but daily, I just spent all night awake and seeing all these media reports and the pictures. The Chinese government is mobilizing the local, some proxies, holding her photo, protesting in front of the events that he's supposed to speak. And also, actually, his events are getting canceled. So this is what he's facing, to just have his voice to be heard. Columbia University here, when I came over from Washington to participate in a panel with one of the Hong Kong activists and the Tibetan and a couple others, it got canceled because of the Chinese students protested. There's a documentary called In Search of My Sister, and it's being screened in different parts. When we arrived in Kazakhstan last year, the film was going to be a part of a documentary film festival. It got canceled. The most of the Uyghurs living in Europe as European citizens, or I am an American citizen, or Canada, Australia, we don't have any protections. Those social media platforms that the Chinese government is using against us, there's no way of protecting us or holding the social medias accountable. So to answer your question, what the government should do, they should recognize transnational repression as a crime, and that's not acceptable. Protect its own citizens, not because we are Uyghurs, because I am also American, and all these people who are living in their local countries, they need some sort of protection from those governments. And also need to pass some legislations to hold the social medias accountable. Those social medias are not available for ordinary Chinese citizens. Yet the Chinese government is mobilizing that, weaponizing that against us. Also, we need to have include Uyghur voices, any kind of policy making and engagements. Just amplify our voice. The governments need to listen to us and not to buy the Chinese government's false narratives. As Ben mentioned, and everyone else here mentioned, the Uyghur girls are forced to marry Han Chinese men daily. We have video clips on the Facebook daily. And the birth rate dropped down to 0%, and the Chinese embassy in the United States publicly celebrated those efforts by saying Uyghur women are no longer baby-making machines. They are not hiding. So we need the governments and the countries to pay attention to this, because now we are not talking about something is happening just within China's borders. It's impacting all of us. It's impacting our future. If we don't hold China accountable now and speak out now, then the only voice left will be one of regret. We are all responsible for what happens next.
Thank you so much, Rashan, and I'm so sorry. It's, there's not the appropriate words to convey just what the challenges that you and others are facing and that your husband is currently facing as well. And Rehan, I know that you have also been the target of a lot of attacks, including online. very worrying, especially as social media companies kind of cut back on trust and safety teams and all of the things that are supposed to try to help to protect. I wanted to just ask you, and then Sophie, one last question before we open it up to questions from the audience. One of the issues that came up was the use of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims for forced labor. And that's something that also touches all of us because we don't know what we're wearing and where it may come from. Or what we're buying. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what can be done to address those issues.
Yeah, and we're actually using the term like forced labor. It gives this meaning somehow like somebody's working against their will. It's like that simple. Something very much dehumanizing about forced labor, and it is a form of slavery. It's a form of human trafficking. As simple as that. This is why the current modern slavery legislation recognized this type of forced labor where individuals reduced to as slaves and working and their slave labor thriving in the global supply chain. In the US, we passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which became a powerful legislation. For the first time, like we shifted the burden of proof that there is no forced labor to the companies, the powerful companies, many of whom actually lobbied against this bill. You know, corporations, until it hurts their bottom line, they're not going to do the right thing. And we've known that throughout historical examples, but as well as the current trends that we're seeing in terms of tech companies very easily complying with fighting against any sort of safe practices and ethical practices. This legislation came often talked a lot about within the context of Uyghurs, but actually it was the first time introduced in light of the North Korean forced labor. But because North Korea in some ways not very much embedded into the global system as much as the Chinese system, that law was not very much utilized and flourished. But until the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, like everybody's attention is on this issue because the Chinese system, China is a part of this global capitalist system. In the European system, they did introduce strong due diligence legislation, but it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't shift the burden. Oftentimes, like the international law often says, like, oh, we give the victims opportunity to sue against corporations through Trafficking Victims Protection Act. But, when individuals sue corporations, they bring the big guns, big law firms that I used to work at one point. And when your nonprofit go against a big law, that asymmetry, there's no way that you can beat against hundreds of lawyers who are actually working with their billable hours, and you're like nonprofit lawyer, but often under-resourced. And that, the previous legislation doesn't really empower victims. So this legislation, on the other hand, does. So for the first time, we saw this shift. And this is why it's important that Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act becomes a global modern slavery legislation. We need to take away corporations' international lawmaking power. When all these corporations lobbied against this bill, it did prolong the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act becoming a law for years. Imagine if we did arrive to that stage sooner, the chances of this law becoming international law would have been much faster. So that is one point, and I really hope, countries from New Zealand to Europe does adopt this legislation. Second is, now Uyghurs, for whatever reason, and I think in large part due to China's economic power, it's been very difficult to forge that kind of solidarity, having the Uyghur issues debated in the global south, especially in countries like Africa, that has a legacy of slavery and understand what does slave trade means. There is a treaty being contemplated currently at the UN through 6th Committee. It's called Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. So we have the Genocide Convention, which does impose state obligation to prevent and deter genocide from happening. Then we have Rome Statute, under which some of the crimes are, including the atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, but it does impose individual responsibility. But the currently contemplated crimes against humanity imposes state responsibility. So a lot of countries are pushing slave trade to be recognized one of the enumerated acts. And I'm very much strong favor of that, because if the slave trade does being recognized as a crimes against humanity, then we may be able to impose a state responsibility to China, given that forced labor transfer scheme is happening. You know, often Uyghurs are being transferred from Urumqi or Xinjiang to other parts of China as well. And Russia actually very much opposed this treaty and voiced its concern. However, China so far hasn't done so. In large part, my assumption is that probably they wouldn't sign or ratify this treaty. So that's why they think that it has nothing to do with China. However, I think there is a potential for Uyghurs, activists, civil society to inform countries in the global south, especially countries like Sierra Leone, who is a big proponent of slave trade being recognized, one of the enumerated crimes, to understand that this is not the kind of issue that is only happening in certain parts of Africa or has happened in Africa, but rather it's happening in China. That's why they need to check in their own collaboration with the Chinese system in terms of doing business. Because after the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, I remember I met this businessman, African businessman, on a train from New Jersey to New York. And he told me that he sells mostly like electronic products. And I asked him, where's his source coming from? And he said, from China. And my immediate response was, do you sell it in America? I was shocked, because my first response to Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, I said, no, I know that there's a very strong law, so I bypass it by selling it to Africa and then re-enter into the United States. And that is something, that loophole is something that we need to close. So that would be my comment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rehan, for incredibly clear strategy there around slavery. And it leads then to a last question before we open it up, and we'll take 2 or 3 at a time. For you, Sophie, what's worked in changing Chinese domestic policy?
Sorry, I was prepared to answer your question about forced labor, so I'm going to change gears here a little bit. Although I do want to add one quick point to my UN to-do list, which is that in November of 2022, the CERD referred the situation in the Uyghur region to the UN Office of Genocide Prevention and to the Office of the Responsibility to Protect, asking them to weigh in and offer an opinion. As far as I know, there has still not been a response to that intervention. If I'm wrong, feel free to correct me. But I think that's an important lever to use too. Naomi, my answer is both everything and nothing. And by nothing, I mean that we continue to see baseless mass arbitrary detentions, whether in informal or formal facilities across the region. We see all manner of human rights violations ongoing without really much of a corrective. At the same time, I think it's also telling the resources that the Chinese government continues to sink into simply fighting, having a conversation about this. And I think that alone should motivate us not just to protect the key institutions through which these sorts of human rights crises should be answered, but also for the sake of protecting those institutions themselves. That may be a little bit too abstract an answer, but we cannot fail in the project of making these institutions function with respect to the Chinese government the way it functions with respect to other governments, right? We see the Human Rights Council criticize the US. Super, great, good, that's fine. That's what it's there for. We see it criticize Western democracies. We see it criticize authoritarian states. The Chinese government consistently gets a free pass. And that is partly a function of the effort that Xi Jinping's government sinks into weakening this system.
Chinese exceptionalism.
And I think it's critical that this system function to hold all states accountable for gross human rights violations. I think this one is a little bit different in the sense that it clearly feels emboldened now to commit more and different kinds of and increasingly serious threats to human rights all over the world. And we can either make these institutions function, or maybe a few years down the track, the note verbal succeeds and we try to have this panel and this room is empty. Which way do we want to go, folks?
Thank you for the call to action, Sophie. I'd like to turn it over to our IPI colleagues who I believe have a microphone for questions. And if we could take maybe 2 or 3 at a time, I'd be grateful. There's a number up front and back.
Hi, thank you, everyone. This is a question for everyone, but I guess primarily to Ben. Shortly after the piece that you wrote about the Uyghur migration into Thailand, as I'm sure many people know, there was a huge crisis with refoulement of many Uyghur refugees, where they were sent back to China, and I am wondering whether, since that happened, you or any of the other panelists have an idea of how this has changed how other states think about their responsibilities towards Uyghurs. I know people I've talked to in Turkey, for example, are like very worried about the possibility that they could just be summarily sent back, and it is happening to other people. So I'm just wondering, like, what has changed in the paradigm since those events.
Thank you very much for this incredible panel and for your courage, my dear sisters. My name is Safa Chadovich. I'm with Justice for All. We have a Safe Uyghur campaign. And for anyone who's interested, on Tuesday we have a briefing at the Senate building in Washington, D.C. on digital tyranny and AI technologies and what's happening with Uyghur culture. You're welcome to talk to me. I know, Ben, I think Arslan sent you an email about that. That being said, my question is with regard to what was mentioned with respect to technologies. We're talking about consumption of products that are made in Xinjiang province, as the Chinese call it, in East Turkestan and other parts of China with slave labor. That's on the consumer side. What about the other side, with regard to the AI technologies and the surveillance state in terms of corporations in the United States and within Europe that are providing the technical components, if not full range of technical capabilities for that surveillance technology and AI technologies to work? Because there's a two-way street when you talk about import and export, and to what extent those companies can be held accountable for the other way in terms of providing that technology, which is resulting in a lot of what you talked about. Thank you.
Thank you. And can we just take one more? There was 2 gentlemen in the back. I'll leave it to IPI. Sorry. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Lou Charbonneau at Human Rights Watch, and I know several of you up there, including Rehan and Sophie, my former colleague. Depressing, fascinating, but really important panel discussion in the film was really quite powerful. So what I wanted to ask about some of the things that have been said about, what can be done, what should be done. We know that the UN leadership has been extremely reluctant to say anything about China. And so my question is whether you think that in the environment that we're in now, if there's really any hope that things could get better. It's been very difficult trying to get UN member states to go on the record to condemn China. I mean, we've managed to do it, those of us who've worked in this, working with UN member states, but in a situation where, the US has been imposing tariffs on countries around the world. There's so much speculation that European Union is going to try to, get even friendlier with China, reduce its focus on human rights. And, this is putting wind in the sails of the Chinese government. Do you think that, what's happening now could actually be a kind of huge, positive boon for the Chinese government, and that really what's happening, particularly with what the U.S. government is doing, is just going to really push us back quite a bit as we try to mobilize governments and raise awareness about what's going on. Thanks.
Thank you for that really critical and timely question. I am going to open it up to the panelists to speak to whichever questions they'd like to. I'd like to start with Rayhan, then Rashan, then Ben, and Sophie.
So first, I would like to take up this question from Lou. Yesterday, I was at a panel, and Ambassador Nick Burns talked about the importance of the U.S. allies, like how, where the United States is facing a formidable adversary, and it's really important for the U.S. to work together with allies to ensure that this international legal order remains as democracy championing for human rights causes. It would be very short-sighted if the EU at this moment, and obviously a lot of policies made the European unions to be very much concerned and even question this US-EU allyship, to then turn to China for leadership or even cozying up to China for trade or other sort of benefits. Not long ago, the Chinese government and Russia, they issued a statement called No Limit Partnership. And in addition to that, they issued their definition of international law. And that is, this decades ago focus on sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-intervention in human rights issues, and so forth. And despite that, when Russia invaded in Ukraine, under charter violations, the Chinese government stood by its no-limit partner, which is Russia in this context. And that international definition also give a pretext to Russia's annexation of Crimea. And in light of all of that, it seems like the European Union's memory seems to be almost too short to forget all of it that had happened, including the sanctioning of the many EU lawmakers. And it seems like the Chinese government now lifting some of the sanctions so that we can move back to this bygone era. Nothing has happened. But a lot of researchers, some of them, maybe most vocal European lawmakers, sanctions still remain the same, including many activists, human rights defenders. Like there is still like ongoing sanctions. So that would be a huge mistake on the part of the EU if that happens. And it's important that institutions like Human Rights Watch reminds them about that. In fact, this is a moment that the EU to step in to take a leadership.
Thank you so much, Rashan.
To answer your question about the Thai deportation, very sadly, after almost 11 years, these people were in detention, in temporarily immigration detention place with extremely poor conditions. But at the end, they were sent back. And their only crime was seeking for a better life and crossing the border illegally to Thailand. I was there in January. I was in the ground in Thailand for like 30-some hours. I changed my program in Tokyo and went there, met with a few embassy people there, trying everything we can. But unfortunately, those 40 people sent back to persecution. The Chinese government used 3 for their propaganda, but what happened to the other 37? What happened to those over 100 that sent back? With that, the Chinese government was emboldened and pressuring other countries to send back more people. Pakistan, there were some Uyghurs in Pakistan, and they were threatened, facing imminent deportation. India and Egypt, and several other countries actually. and U.S. is trying really hard. State Department is trying to stop those deportations and to bring those people out of those countries. But the allies, especially the countries in Europe, we need help. We need your help to give these people home. Those 48 Uyghurs in Thailand, they lived there because no country was willing to accept them. The countries, the Western democratic allies were not putting a pressure enough to Thailand government to release them. And United Nations, UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, they would not give them refugee status. That is one of the problem why at the end, tragically, these people went back. To answer your question from the Human Rights Watch about the UN, Sophie and Rehan and we all were there last year for the UPR, China's UPR sessions, pre-sessions. The harassment that we face, the people, they're taking our pictures and pushing us around and not allowing us to go into the room, all this, we tried to report, but we lost faith in the UN system because the Chinese government is acting like UN is its playground, the backyard, basically, getting away. While the entire Uyghur population is facing forced sterilization, forced abortions, forced marriages, the Uyghur women's bodies are being the battleground of this genocide. Who represents women and the girls' rights in the UN? Xi Jinping's wife, Peng Liyuan, as a special envoy. So that's the system we are talking about. But the member states need to raise their voice. They need to act. They need to use that system that we have established because of atrocity, like similar to what Uyghurs are facing today. The UN is being built on the foundation and the principles of not to allow a country act like this against one ethnicity or nation. Our friend here from Washington, from the Save Uyghur, we really need to work hard, and your organization as well, to give political asylum for those handful of Uyghurs in the United States. We are not talking about thousands, just a couple hundred. Yet, these people are getting like their political asylum, court is getting denied their asylum cases, and they are in United States still with no valid status. So Representative Young Kim has new legislation. We really need to push hard to pass that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashawn. Ben.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'll just answer the one that was addressed to me. I think the case of the deportations from Thailand is instructive in showing, in fact, how much worse the situation for Uyghurs in exile has become over the past 10 years. So, you know, there was a max exodus from China of Uyghurs before the rise of these mass internment camps, and thousands fled, many fled using human smuggling routes through Southeast Asia. And so in 2014, as our Times investigation goes into, there was a large group of Uyghurs coming through Thailand trying to reach Malaysia, from which they could reach Turkey, which was their ultimate destination. And hundreds were detained in a series of raids. And for about a year, nothing happened. They were in Thai immigration detention centers. And then in 2015, some of this group was permitted to move on to Malaysia and from there to Turkey. Most of the women and children and some of the men, and the distinction between those who were released and held seems to have been arbitrary. And then Thailand deported at least 105 and maybe more back to China. And this was a major international incident. The US issued sanctions against Thailand. I believe the UK did as well. It was widely seen as a major screw up. And there are various theories as to why this happened. But it was an international incident. It reflected very badly on Thailand's government at the time. because it was understood that these were legitimate asylum seekers. And since then, some Uyghurs who were not deported have been continuously held in Thai detention, or were for 11 years. And we reported on this population. We spoke with them in the detention center in Bangkok where they were being held. None of them had any clear connection to any criminal activity. There was no reason for them to be held rather than to send on to a third country, or for another solution to be found. And these conditions were squalid. Over 10 years, at least 5 people died, including 2 very young children who were being held in detention. And the most recent deaths were just a couple years ago in 2022. And then a few months after our report came out, following a change of government in Thailand, despite vocal opposition by the U.S. Secretary of State, by various members of U.S. Congress and French Parliament, most of these remaining Uyghurs were deported back to China. And unlike in 2015, it was not an international incident. In fact, there was very little news about it at all. There were crickets. And I think this demonstrates the decay of this kind of rules-based international order and the right to asylum as practice. And of course, Thailand is not a signatory to some of the UN conventions on asylum, but there are conventions to which they are signatories, which they violated in deporting these men. But I think the difference between the response to the previous mass deportation and this one is instructive, and I think it's justifiable that Uyghurs living in Turkey, where they often have precarious residency status, or they're not able to legally work, or they do not have political asylum, are justified in being afraid that they could also be deported back to China. Just last year, I mean, this isn't just happening in like Southeast Asia or Central Asia. Last year, the European Court of Justice had to step in to stop a Uyghur couple from being deported from Malta because China had demanded their deportation. So these deportations can happen in Europe. They can happen anywhere without robust protections of the right to asylum, which Uyghurs fleeing China clearly deserve.
Thank you, Ben. And finally, Sophie.
I'm going to try to do this quickly. To the question over here about US and European tech firms selling surveillance gear to authorities in the Uyghur region, I don't think there's ever been nearly enough scrutiny, investigation, prosecution, export controls, tick on down the list. We know that various companies have sold gear that's been used in abuses, and it's a whole area for more research and I think activism. And I would encourage anybody who's in a position to do that to follow through on it. On sort of the big picture question, Lou, nice to see you. On the one hand, I think Xi Jinping probably can't believe his luck just at the moment. On the other hand, I can see this breaking a couple of different ways. And what I mean by that is that particularly as the US takes a turn towards authoritarian tactics, and I think that prompts a lot of thinking across a lot of governments. And I should say that not all governments come to this conversation with the same kind of resources, right? But I think particularly for more affluent democracies, many of whom have now themselves, I think, been mugged by the reality of Xi Jinping's government in one way or another. And I think particularly for European governments, the idea that Xi is supporting Putin in Ukraine may, I think, prompt governments to have to take a deep breath and realize that they are going to have to push back against abusive tactics by a number of different kinds of governments, including ones they used to consider allies. I think we're going to learn a lot about individual governments' willingness and ability and their diagnoses of where threats come from and how best to push back against those. I think, to me, some of the indicators that democracies in particular are willing to both try to strengthen international human rights systems and fight the good rights fight will be, backing a Secretary General and a High Commissioner for Human Rights who are just as willing to call out Chinese government abuses as they are to call out democracy's abuses, right? We'll see it when those governments leave no fund position, special rapporteur, treaty body, working group, to be filled by authoritarian regimes like Beijing. Right? Those are some of the diagnostics that I would look for, but I think we're in for a rough ride. And the Chinese government devotes enormous resources towards advancing its agenda internationally, and particularly at a time when attention is focused elsewhere. Do we have a different Secretary of State than when this panel started? Right? Like, there's a lot of chaos out there in the world, folks. And this is a really optimal environment, I think, for the Chinese Communist Party to get out and execute its agenda. And I think this is a tough time for democratic governments, but I think we're going to find out what they're made of.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, I think that merits a round of applause. I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to very sincerely thank the teams at IPI and at the Simon-Skjodt Center, and most of all, the courageous panelists that we have here with us. Every single day, Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims are facing just horrific persecution and repression. Yet the public awareness about what they're enduring in the Uyghur region comes in waves. What remains constant is the pain that the victims and their loved ones endure from the arbitrary arrest, imprisonments, forced disappearance, sexual violence, torture, and other ill treatment. And we know so much about what the Chinese government has been doing because of the tireless efforts of survivors and their families. And I want to thank those of you that are joining us here today to make sure that the world remembers what's happening. I'd like to thank the allies in that effort, Ben, Sam, Matt, and Sophie, for the work that you've been doing to try to make sure that we don't forget. And today, our panelists addressed the myriad of policy challenges that exist in the multilateral space, and when confronting a government like China that will go to great lengths to hide their crimes, and will go to even greater lengths at times to try to fight those who try to elevate their voices and shed light on what's really happening. Each of them today highlighted that there are things that can and need to be done, and they called on governments and the UN bodies to work and support Uyghur civil society and the private sector to help develop swift, coordinated, and a global strategy to protect the Uyghur community. Despite opportunities for protection, justice, diplomatic action, and financial accountability that exists, there's no such strategy today. Hopefully that will change, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. For those who weren't able to ask their questions, the panelists are here and can talk after it. Thank you again so much.